Ladies and gents, it's your boy, it's your main event. Howdy. If there's any two things we love on this channel, it's ITP MMA and simping. Let's check out this video about Joe Rogan and his podcast.
We have to be better people. She had this message while I was interviewing her in the cage after winning a fight. And she's like, we got to be nicer to each other.
Alright, so Joe Rogan obviously has one of the biggest platforms in the entire world, podcast or otherwise. And along the way, he's immortalized some pretty bizarre and dare I say even pathetic moments to the internet, namely in the form of blatantly simping over several different women, sometimes right to their face. Obviously, this is an MMA channel, so I'm going to focus on the 2 times where Joe's simped over UFC fighters, but you can find numerous clips online of Joe trying to flirt with some of his other female guests. Okay, so the first example that I want to talk about happened in August of 2015 when Joe straight up started crying over Ronda Rousey right to her face. And even though a lot of UFC fans already know that this happened, I still feel like this isn't talked about nearly as much as it should because this was just an utterly bizarre thing for Joe to do. The first 20 minutes of this episode isn't too crazy. It was mainly just Joe and Ronda talking about random stuff, but I feel like you can definitely tell that Joe was laughing a little bit too hard at the things that Ronda was saying. Like, Ronda wasn't even trying to be funny in most of these cases, yet Joe would be belly laughing like she was saying the funniest shit he's ever heard. But at around the 21-minute mark is when Joe starts terraforming into the Simp Supreme. During Joe and Ronda talking about her most recent win over Betch Kohea, Joe starts laying it on unbelievably thick with his emotional gushing to the point where he legitimately starts getting teary-eyed.
And knowing you as long as I've had and having daughters, and it was so emotional for me. That was the closest I've ever come to crying while I was I might cry now when I was interviewing somebody. It's because it was so intense, and it was also like I really knew that I was seeing history. It's like it's hard. I know it's hard for you to probably talk about it because you're living it right now, but you're in the middle of history.
Come on, bro. Joe was just being ridiculous in this moment. He says that he might start crying right then and there, then he follows it up by theatrically getting choked up, and then he even wipes away an imaginary tear from his eye. I'm sorry, but this is an embarrassing display out of Joe, and I'm not gonna lie, ever since I first saw this, it's made it harder for me to take him seriously, and I say this as someone who deeply respects Joe as a UFC commentator and as a content creator. And the thing is, we all know Joe. He definitely likes to ham things up for dramatic effect, and he's pretty famous for being a hyperbolic person, but in this case, I don't know if he was actually being serious or if he was just acting like this in hopes to impress Ronda or something, but the thing is, I don't know which is worse. Because I'm not sure which is more pathetic, Joe, a grown-ass man, genuinely being moved to tears while discussing a women's MMA fight, or Joe, a grown-ass man, hamming up a situation to the point where he pretends to cry right in front of Ronda's face. But it's regardless of how sincere Joe was actually being, this is still a ridiculously embarrassing thing for Joe to do here. And I don't care how much of a fan Joe was of Ronda, and I don't care how big of a superstar Ronda was.
Joe was talking about Ronda would have knocked out Floyd Mayweather back in those days. It's crazy. It's crazy.
At this point in time, Joe was a fucking 48-year-old man at the time this podcast episode happened. There is no reason for a man his age to be crying over women's MMA like this. Seriously, is there an athlete or a celebrity that you guys know where if you started talking to them about their achievements, you would start crying in front of them? Because I know that I don't. The only times I have ever seen people cry when they meet their favorite public figure are little girls. So at this point, some of you might be saying, oh, Joe's just passionate about the sport. He's been a fan.
He did mention he has daughters, which I feel like you can't devalue that part of it.
Of the UFC since the very beginning. You just don't love the sport as much as he does. And all of those things are probably true, but I've been following the sport religiously since I was about 12 years old, and if becoming a fan of MMA to the level that Joe is includes openly crying when I talk about women's MMA, then I don't want to become that big of a fan. I love this sport, I love the fighters, but I love my self-respect even more, and I cannot for the life of me become so parasocially attached to women's MMA to the point where I cry when I speak with the fighters. Okay, with all of this being said, do I actually think that Joe was acting like this in hopes of getting in Ronda's pants? Well, maybe. Because first and foremost, this podcast episode was recorded about a year after Ronda and Brendan Schaub ended their little fling that they had, and a couple of months before Ronda and Travis Browne went public with their relationship. So for all intents and purposes, as far as Joe was aware, Ronda was on the market as a free agent, so maybe he thought he had a chance at scoring. Not only that, going back all the way to 2012, Ronda's been very open and honest that she has a ton of sex before all of her fights, and if she's having a lot of sex in the lead up to her fights, it's probably safe to assume that she's having even more fun when she's not in training camps. And before people start calling me an incel and start acting like I'm criticizing Ronda for having lots of sex, I genuinely could not care less. She is a grown-ass woman and she can do whatever she wants in her personal life. I'm just saying, Joe for sure saw the articles of Ronda being so open with her sex life, and maybe, just maybe, he thought that he could get drafted into Ronda's roster. Anyways, on top of all of this, Joe and Brendan were close friends by this time, so I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest to find out that Brendan gave Joe all of the dirty deets into Ronda's promiscuity. And look, obviously this is all just speculation. Maybe Joe was trying to hook up with Ronda, but maybe Joe wasn't trying to at all. Regardless, the way that Joe is acting right in front of Ronda's face here is so bizarre to me, and yeah, I'll say it, it's pretty laughable and pathetic to me as well. I mean, it makes it even worse that Joe had made public statements that Ronda could beat 50% of the men's bantamweight division, which is an absurd thing to say even at the height of Ronda's career. And again, I get that Joe was a massive fan of Ronda and her unprecedented success, but I really can't shake the feeling that maybe he had some ulterior motives behind all of this glazing. Anyways, in Joe's defense, he's walked back a lot of the praise that he gave to Ronda and has admitted that he just got caught up in the hype, and since he's done this, it seems like he and Ronda are no longer exactly on the most friendly of terms anymore. Anyways, I can talk more about the Ronda example, but we have to move on to the next case of Joe's simpery. Because in this next example where Joe nearly starts crying over Rose Namajunas, I wouldn't say it's as pathetic as him crying right in front of Ronda's face, but I do think it's a weirder situation, and I'll explain why in a moment. But first, check out these clips from this JRE episode featuring Carol Hooven that took place in 2021.
She's super emotional. Like, there was a video of me interviewing her after she just re-won her title. She's beautiful. She shaves her head so she doesn't have to think about her hair. But if you see her with long hair, she's a gorgeous woman. She looks like a model. She's a champion of the world. That's how beautiful she is.
Gosh.
Yeah, she's fucking stunning.
Oh
she's
my
gorgeous.
gosh.
She's
Okay.
gorgeous.
No, this
and
is
she is the champion of the fucking world. She's the 115-pound champion of the world.
She's tiny.
When she won the title the first time, when I was interviewing her, one of the things she was saying is just, we have to be better people. She like had this message while I was interviewing her in the cage after winning a fight. And she's like, we got to be nicer to each other. That was her message.
Okay, so does anyone else feel like Joe was once again hamming it up to a comical degree in this one? Like, even though I do agree with him that Rose with long hair was a beautiful girl, the way that he talks about her looks just feels so unnecessarily intense and dramatic. And oh my god, the last part of this clip where he's on the verge of breaking down and he gets all choked up makes me laugh every single time that I watch it. Like, I've straight up seen this clip no less than a dozen times, and without fail, every single time I see Joe on the verge of tears, I start cracking up. I also love the face of Carol Hooven when the camera cuts back to her. She looks so unimpressed by what Joe is saying, and I can't help but feel like she feels a little bit uncomfortable with how weird Joe is behaving here. And he's definitely acting very weird, like the manner in which he's speaking and the faces that he's making at this lady who clearly couldn't give less of a shit.
Like, he's trying to invoke an emotion from this woman for Rose. It's weird. It's weird why he's trying to evoke these emotions, and she doesn't know who this person is. She doesn't give a shit
About Rose Namajunas is just comedy gold to me.
Cage after winning a fight. And she's like, we got to be nicer to each other. That was her message.
Not to mention, Joe is either 53 or 54 years old here. Are you seriously about to burst into tears over this girl saying that people need to be nicer to one another? Anyways, on the topic of simping, I do think that Joe is categorically simping over Rose here, especially with how enthusiastic he gets about her beauty or whatever, and him nearly breaking out into tears is the icing on the simp cake. But the question that I keep coming back to is why? Like, why is Joe hardcore simping over Rose, who isn't even in the same room as they are, much less the same state? It just seems so strange to me that Joe is absolutely gushing over Rose to this person who's effectively a complete stranger to him. Like, is this just a matter of not being very self-aware in this moment, or
stranger to Joe and has no idea who Rose is? He has to explain all this. Like, why are they even having this conversation?
Could this be some sort of play out of Joe? I really have no idea what to make of this. And this is why I think this situation is weirder than the Ronda one, because on one hand, I really don't believe that Joe thinks he can get with Rose. Obviously, Rose and Pat Barry are in a super committed, super long-term relationship, so I highly doubt that Joe is trying to make some sort of play at Rose or anything. So is there a chance that Joe is doing all of this to maybe impress his guest here, Carol Hooven? I mean, they do seem to be of similar age or whatever, and she is a university professor, so maybe he thinks she'll be impressed by him showering another woman with praise to show how woke he is or something. I don't know, I really don't. I just know that I find all of this hilariously weird, and whenever I watch this clip, I always start trying to find reasonable motives to help explain why Joe, who's a flawed but usually reasonable person, starts acting like such a weirdo in this moment. Like seriously, can you imagine you are talking to a relative stranger and you start crying over someone that you also barely know and that this person doesn't know at all? I don't know, maybe Joe is sincerely complimenting Rose here with no ulterior motives behind it, but if this is the case, Jesus Christ, my man, you gotta read the room here. You are at a 10 right now. You gotta dial this shit back to a 5 maximum. Alright, so those are the main examples that I wanted to talk about for this video. There are other cases of Joe simping over his female guests, much like when—
Damn, that lady's face is so fucking funny, dude. That shit was awesome. This is great work.
he was really trying to flirt with this Asian girl who he brought on the show, and I also definitely get the vibe that he was trying to flirt with Tulsi Gabbard when he brought her on the podcast as well. And all of this to say, I am not hating on Joe for any of this stuff, and it definitely doesn't make him a bad person for blatantly simping over these ladies. It's just funny. It's funny to watch good old Joe act in ways that we normally don't see him behave over these women that he may or may not be attracted to. Also, I understand that Joe is a married man, and I can say that open relationships do exist, and I can say that we don't know what Joe does behind closed doors, but I will say that in my opinion, it's hard to deny that in the Rose and Ronda examples, the guy is definitely hamming it up for one reason or another. And you might disagree with me on this, but that's okay, that's your opinion, and this is mine. Anyways, I don't know what else to say, so I guess I'll end the video here. Definitely let me know your thoughts on Joe's behavior when it comes to how he spoke to Ronda and how he spoke about Rose. Do you think that he was acting like the simp supreme like I do, or do you think that this was Joe just being his overly dramatic and hyperbolic self? As always, if you like the video, then like the video, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so. I appreciate you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.
So with ITP MMA talking about the simp lord himself, Joe Rogan. It's where we all get it from. But that's crazy, man. This man is crying on his podcast over these random fighters. These female fighters for whatever reason. I mean, with the Ronda thing, he did mention he had daughters, so I'm going to try to cut him a little bit of slack there. But the Rose part, he could have added in all kinds of clips of Joe Rogan simping over Rose Namajunas. Matter of fact, I'm not going to find it. That video was pretty smooth. I rocks with that video. Shout out to ITP MMA. Simps Unite. Hit that like, hit that subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.